Today is Module 18, Absolute Value and Opposites. So what does absolute value mean? Absolute value describes the distance that a number is on the number line without considering direction. The absolute value of a number is never negative. Okay, it's not negative because we are talking about distance and we couldn't describe distance as being negative. For example, if you asked someone how far they live from Jackson, they could not tell you a number that's negative. They couldn't say they lived negative 20 miles from there. So the absolute value is always positive. Let's look at some examples. The absolute value of 5 is 5. Why? Because the distance from 5 to 0 is 5 units or 5 spaces. We don't care that it's to the right. We're not worried about direction. We just want to know how far it is. The absolute value of negative 5 is 5 because the distance from negative 5 to 0 is also 5 units or 5 spaces. Okay, so let's look at how we write absolute value. We write absolute value by putting the integer between these vertical lines. Okay, these vertical lines stand for absolute value. So the absolute value of 6 equals 6 means the absolute value of 6 is 6. That's how you read this. Same with our negative 6. The absolute value of 6 is negative 6. Why? Because 6 and negative 6 are both 6 places from 0. Okay, so any number you have here, we're just talking about how far it is from 0, and it will always be positive. So I apologize for the blurry questions here at the bottom, but let's take a look at some examples. So A would be read, what is the absolute value of negative 4? In other words, how far from 0 is negative 4? Well, it is 4 spaces from 0. What is the absolute value of 26? 26, because it is 26 spaces from 0. What is the absolute value of negative 18? 18, because it's 18 places from 0. What is the absolute value of negative 3? 3, because negative 3 is 3 places from 0. What is the absolute value of negative 44? 44, because negative 44 is 44 spaces from 0. What is the absolute value of 65? 65, because it is 65 places from 0. Notice again that absolute value can never be negative. It's always going to be positive. And some of you have figured out that whatever the number is that's inside the lines is your answer. You just take that number, leave off the sign, and that's your answer. It's a little trick for you. Okay, let's look at opposites. Opposite and absolute value are not the same. We're not talking about opposites when we're talking about absolute value. We're talking about distance here. So the absolute value of an integer is the same distance from 0, but in the opposite direction. Here we are concerned about whether it's to the left or the right of 0. For example, the opposite of positive 5 is negative 5, and the opposite of negative 5 is positive 5. And we can prove that. If you want to make one of these lines a number line, we're going to have 0 in the middle. We're going to go all the way to positive 5 here on the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Negative 5 on the left. The opposite of positive 5 is negative 5. Why? Because they are the same distance from 0, but in opposite directions. Opposite directions. Just like hot and cold are opposites, tall and short are opposites, positive and negative are opposites. So you're going to use the opposite sign. Okay. Before we go over here to the opposite of the opposite, let's look at some examples. Again, I apologize for the blurry number lines. The directions say to mark each integer and its opposite value on the number line. Always be sure you read your directions, guys. I am even guilty of not reading the directions sometimes. But if you were just to plot the integers and forget to plot the opposite, then half of your problem would be wrong. Take a second to write the word plot on top of the word mark. Sometimes when we are graphing numbers or marking numbers on a number line, they might ask you to plot the number, and to plot simply means to draw a dot. Whoops. Simply means to draw a dot. So here we have the integer -4, so we would put a dot on the number line at -4, and the opposite of -4 is +4. And we can prove that because they are both 4 spaces from 0, but in the opposite direction. I think the man in the video in the module was drawing the lines here so that you could see that they're opposites. You're not required to do that, but I do want you to know why they're opposites. Okay, graph the integer 6 and its opposite, which is -6. So we plot 6 and we plot -6. Again, you can see that they're the same distance from 0, but in opposite directions. Plot the integer -7 and its opposite 7. I'm sorry, this is a 1. -1 and its opposite 1. So we would plot -1 and its opposite 1. There, it's very easy to tell that they're the same distance from 0 in opposite directions. Okay, last topic for Module 18. It's a little bit confusing, but it's called the opposite of the opposite. The opposite of the opposite. Sometimes we have situations where we were maybe negative, but we reversed that negative. We had the opposite of the negative. So, the opposite of the opposite. One thing that I want you to remember, if you'll draw the little negative sign here, this negative sign can have a lot of different meanings. It could say minus, it could be a hyphen, but we're not subtracting and we're not writing, doing any kind of writing with hyphenation. So we are going to say that this is a negative, or we could use the word opposite. Opposite. Because when we use the word negative, we're talking about the opposite of a positive number. Okay? Now this is where it gets tricky. When you see two opposites here, this says the opposite of 9, or you could say it means the negative of -9, but both of those sound a little bit tricky, so let me give you a hint. For the negative sign that is inside the parentheses, use the word negative. So for the sign that's there with the number, just say -9. Whoops, -9. Okay? Anything outside of the parentheses, we're going to use the word opposite. So listen to the statement now. What is the opposite of -9? Oh, the opposite of -9 is simply 9. So how do we write that? Of course, we saw the directions here. Two negatives, the opposite of negative 9. The opposite of negative 9 is equal to 9. The opposite of the opposite is the original number. It would be like if you had $0 in your bank account, you became overdrawn $20, but then you added $20 back in. That would get you to your original balance. So for any number, the opposite of the negative is the original number. So for example, the opposite of negative 8 is 8. Here we're using the word opposite. Here we're using the word negative. The opposite of negative 4 is 4. Here we're using the word opposite. Here we're using the word negative. Now, every once in a while, there might be one test question about the opposite of the opposite of the opposite, okay? Because just right here, if you were overdrawn 20 and put 20 back in and then took 20 back out, you know, sometimes we have situations where there are more than one negative or opposite. So again, we're going to use the word negative here and opposite here. So we have 6. Negative 6. The opposite of negative 6 is 6, but the opposite of 6 is negative 6. Let me show you again. We have negative 6. The opposite of negative 6 is 6, and the opposite of 6 is negative 6. Okay? We could have written it like this, because remember, this sign can mean opposite or negative. So we have negative 6. The opposite of negative 6 is 6. The opposite of 6 is negative 6. Again, I'm not sure if you will ever see that, but I did want to introduce it. And before we wrap up this module, I wanted you to know something. I wanted you to recognize something. Have you ever heard the phrase, 2 wrongs don't make a right? Well, that might be the case, but look what happens when you have 2 opposites. The opposite of negative 4 is 4. So you could say, you're right, 2 wrongs don't make a right, but 2 negatives make a positive. I always kind of envisioned these 2 negatives like kind of coming together to form a positive. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Be sure you watch the videos, all of the videos in Module 18. There's some good videos here about absolute value and opposites. Let's head to the batting cages. Y'all did